Now, we all love getting out there for some great adventures on our e-mountain bikes, but sadly those rides do have to come to an end at some point. But the work doesn't stop when that power switch is turned off. There's plenty to be doing as soon as you get back. Here's a few things you should do post-ride. Now, firstly, you're going to have to wash your bike. Now, this depends on where you've been riding and the type of conditions you've been riding in. For dry, dusty rides, you can simply get away with using a microfiber cloth to wipe the dust away from your bike. No water needed. For anything more than a light dust covering, something like this waterless wash from Muck Off is going to be ideal. It's going to lift that dirt super easy without subjecting your bike to a load of water unnecessarily. And for those rides where you're absolutely caked in mud, it is time to get the bike cleaner, some brushes, and of course the power washer or a hose pipe is going to make it super easy to get all of that mud off. Just remember to use your head when you're using water around the motor, the battery, and your control unit. Now, if you use water to wash your bike, it's really important to dry your bike after properly too. If you don't dry it, water's going to creep into those electrical components, and some of that steel stuff will rust as well, particularly your chain and possibly the battery terminals too. So it's really important to get in there to dry it off. So to dry the bike off after I've washed it, I just bounce it up and down on the wheels just to drive off that excess moisture. Then I like to use a microfiber cloth all over the frame, just to make sure every single bit of water is actually being removed from that bike. And in the areas that I can't see, I use a water displacing spray. That's really good at getting to those nooks and crannies and all those electrical connections and driving that water out. And it also provides a protective layer on there after as well. So it's going to protect you from that water that comes in the next time. It's simply going to run off rather than pool up. Then it's time to pay attention to probably the most important part on your e-mountain bike, and I'm talking about the drivetrain. Before we dry this off, we need to clean it properly and make sure all that gunk and trail debris and old lube is removed from the chain. Now, a couple of options for this one. You can use a drivetrain cleaner and a traditional chain bath to run your chain through. And as it goes through this machine, it's got a few brushes on there which agitate all that grime and gunk off of your chain and leave it in the bottom. It's a pretty clean way of doing it. Your other option is going to be a spray, which you can literally spray onto your chain. It's going to eat all that oil off there. Pretty much does the same job, but it's in a spray format. It depends on how deep you want to go with that. Then it's time to inspect the chain. After you've cleaned it all off, you need to inspect each link, see if there's any damage or twisting going on with it that could pay, the end to your next ride. So inspection is really important too. Now, once you're happy with that chain and it's in full working order and within wear limits, it's time to apply that lube. But before you apply that lube, just make sure that that chain is bone dry. If you apply lube to a wet chain, it's simply going to lock all that moisture in there and rust it out. And when it comes to lube, you need to make sure you're using the right lube for the conditions that you're riding in. If you're riding in wet weather, then you definitely need to use a wet weather lube. This is a lot thicker than dry weather lube, and it'll really penetrate and stick on those chain rollers and making sure it doesn't get washed off when the rain comes. Now, if you're riding in dry conditions, you definitely need dry lube. This is designed to evaporate really quickly off of that chain and leave a non-sticky formula on there that's going to provide protection for the chain but won't attract dust. But if you do ride this stuff in the wet, it's simply going to wash off. But in the middle ground, you've got an all conditions lube. Now, this is the best of both worlds. It's going to provide protection in the wet and of course the dry. Now it's time to apply some lube to the chain. Now, I've checked the weather forecast and it looks like rain, so I'm applying some wet lube. Now the lube is usually better applied with the bike up in a work stand, so you can cycle the cranks round and apply the lube as the chain goes round. But if your bike is on the floor, you'll notice when you back pedal, the chain doesn't actually move. So I've got a nice little hack for you. All you need to do is jam the chainring up against the crank arm by means of a tool or anything you can find. For this, I'm just going to be using a little branch with a bit of hose pipe on. Simply slot it into the crank, lock it on, and as I cycle the chainring backwards, you'll notice that the whole lot moves together. Then we simply just going to be applying lube to the chain as we cycle the cranks backwards. So when you're applying the lube, it's really important to apply it to the inside of the chain, the part that actually contacts the chainring and the cassette. If you put it onto the top side of the chain, when that chain goes round the chainring, it's simply going to fall away and not penetrate the rollers properly. Also, when lubing the chain, it's a really good idea just to try and pinpoint each roller as you go and apply the lube. It might be a bit of a lengthy process, but it's really going to allow you to inspect that chain and not waste a load of lube. So there's actually a few mistakes that a lot of people will actually do when it comes to lubing a chain. Let's take a look at a few of the common ones. Now, one of the most common mistakes I see a lot of riders doing is applying lube to their chain all over the cassette. Now, if you're using a spray lube for doing this, it's simply going to blow and transfer all over your rear disc rotor, meaning your rear brake's going to be contaminated. I really favour a dropper bottle for applying chain lube over a spray lube. Now, if you are using a spray lube on your chain, you need to be applying it at the front of the chainring rather than over the back of the cassette. Or if you are using it on the cassette, you need to make sure that you're going to be covering that rear disc to make sure none of that lube is transferred onto it. Now, another classic is lying a freshly lubed chain bike down on the ground. Now, if you do this, all of that lube that's potentially loose on your chain could drop through the cassette and again go onto that rear disc brake rotor, rendering it pretty useless. If you do need to lie your bike down after lubing the chain, just gently lie it on the drive side. Just make sure your derailleur isn't contacting the ground, and that way any lube that does fall off is going to fall onto the ground, not onto your back brake. Now, one thing I see a lot of riders doing is applying more lube to an already dirty chain, assuming that it's going to lube it. All you're going to be doing is locking all that grime and debris that's from the trail into that chain, in fact accelerating that wear process even more. So you need to make sure it is clean, dry, then apply the lube. And lastly, the classic, I see riders everywhere winding their chains around, applying loads of chain lube to it, literally splashing it around and running off the chain. You're not lubing your chain this way, you're simply going to make it a sticky, gooey mess that's going to pick up every single bit of dust on the trail and again, really enhance that wear. If you do apply too much lube, just make sure you run a cloth around it to try and remove as much excess as possible, because if you don't, it's simply going to be a sticky mess and not do any good for your bike at all. So that's it, your bike is all clean and nicely lubed up, ready for your next adventure. Now, of course, if you do have parts that are worn out, just remember to order them up so you're not going to cause any excess wear on things like your drivetrain. But then, just put your feet up, look at your Strava, and plan your next adventure. But if you've got any more tips on how to keep on top of that lube on your e-bike, we'd love to hear it. Get involved in the comments box down below. Give a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe to us here on EMBN and check out the merch shop too. And give us a find and a follow on social media too. Cheers and keep it lubed.